Welcome back. We're continuing our walk through the book of Habakkuk. If you have missed previous episodes, this is a sequential study. So they are meant to be done in order. This may be the first Disciple Dojo video you've seen. Maybe you clicked on the thumbnail. Maybe YouTube's algorithm popped it up in your feed. Don't watch this video if that's the case. Go back and watch the first video in this series. We are walking through this often overlooked and very confusing at times book that has profound relevance for our world today. The commentaries and the resources that you'll see me quote from, we've put those in the link below so you can tap on the video description. It'll show you all that. And again, this study is meant to be used not just for individual study, but in a small group or a Sunday school or a campus ministry setting. So if you appreciate this type of in-depth biblical teaching, line by line, looking at the original languages, we would love to invite you, if you haven't already, to subscribe to this channel and tap the little notifications icon when you do. Just an extra way, doesn't cost you anything, but it helps us continue doing this type of teaching here on YouTube. All right, let's jump right back into Habakkuk. We are still in chapter 1. So to recap, the book of Habakkuk begins as the burden that Habakkuk the prophet beheld, and then it starts with his crying out to God with almost an indictment. And specifically, he's crying about things like violence, like disaster and toil, destruction, lawsuit, strife. Torah has grown cold. Justice doesn't go forth. If it does go forth, it goes forth crooked, and it's because wickedness is surrounding the righteous. And then God's response almost seems to make it worse. God says, lift your eyes up, look upon the nations. Or if you take the Septuagint reading, he's actually talking to the kingdom of Judah, which would include Habakkuk and everyone. But he's saying, watch and be utterly horrified. And the Septuagint goes even a little further and adds, and perish. So bad news. This is not what you want to hear when you're crying out in prayer that, oh, things are about to get a lot worse. God says, for a working in your days, and you could translate it, most translations say a work, I am working in your days, but it could just be a work is working in your days. Either way, you will not believe it when it's recounted, or you will not believe it even if you were told. Now this verse, we didn't mention this in the last episodes, but this verse gets yanked out of context all the time. People want a word from the Lord. They want to give somebody a biblical encouragement. And they say, God's doing a work in your days. You wouldn't even believe it even if you're told, as if that's a good thing. Contextually, it is not a good thing. Contextually, it is a horrifying thing. So very important, when you start to quote Bible verses, make sure you at least understand the context that that verse originally is situated in. And then if you want to use it to make like a rhetorical point or to use it ironically or something like that, that's okay. The New Testament authors do that at times, but just be careful. This is not a message of prosperity. This is not a message of your new year, new you, blessing is right around the corner. This is none of that. This is actually, things are about to get terrible, Habakkuk. And in verse 6, he goes on to say, verses 6 through 10, I'm raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. And he describes them bitter, swift, going to the breadths of the earth, taking possession of dwellings, literally tents, not his own, terrifying, feared. From himself, his justice goes forth, like not accountable to anyone. The Chaldeans, the Babylonians, they are a law unto themselves. They're faster than leopards. He talks about the cavalry, this image of a terrifying army, sharper or quicker than wolves of the evening or wolves of Arabia, depending on whether this is Erev or Arabah. But these are fearsome horsemen. They leap from a distance, they come, and they fly like an eagle hurrying to eat. Like they're going to be swiftly coming in and devouring. We talked about verse 9, that there's ambiguity in this middle line, the totality of their faces eastward or something like that. But the first line and the third line are very clear. Each of him for violence he comes, and he gathers captives like sand. This is this Babylonian warrior that is prophetically in the image of the poetry standing for the armies of Babylon, scoffs at kings, dignitaries are a joke to him, and he at every fortress laughs. He heaps up dirt and captures her. And this was a common tactic. This is talking about a siege. In fact, here, this is from Logos Bible Software, but here's an actual depiction of the siege of Lachish. Lachish was a mighty, high-walled, double-walled city that was almost impregnable, but it was captured. And you can see them literally heaping up dirt and building these ramps up to the walls of the city, and then these siege towers that they would push to come in and to knock the walls down, and that troops would use to get in. And so you can just see all the debris flying, and there's ladders and defenders and shields atop the wall. This is ancient warfare, ancient siege warfare, and it was brutal, and Babylon was even better at it than the Assyrians. And this is the Assyrians who captured Lachish in this instance. This is King Sennacherib. You can read about this in 2 Kings 18 and 19, 2 Chronicles 32, Isaiah 36, 37. Well, after that, it's like God saying, oh, you thought Assyria was bad? Babylon is about to be worse, and I'm raising them up. And the other prophets let us know that God's raising them up as an implement of judgment against Judah, against the southern kingdom here. So in the 600s, all the way up until 587 BC, when the southern kingdom was finally completely destroyed by the Babylonians, and Nebuchadnezzar took all of the people from the southern kingdom. I mean, there were some that were left and stayed and kind of intermingled, but they were the peasants. They were the outliers, the country folk. The city, Jerusalem, was destroyed. The people were killed. The temple was destroyed, and everybody who was anybody was either fled down to Egypt, like the prophet Jeremiah and some others ended up fleeing to Egypt, and the rest were carted off to exile in Babylon. So this is God's answer to the first part in Habakkuk chapter 1. And Habakkuk's response, it shows chutzpah. It shows a willingness to not just, okay, Lord, as you say, so it shall be. I'm fine with this. Your sovereignty is, the most important thing. No, Habakkuk doesn't do that. He says, Halo ata mekedem Adonai Elahai Kadshi. Are you not from old, or are you not ancient? My God, my Holy One. And then this next line, there's an interesting phenomenon going on here. There's a tiknei sofarim. So it's like a note that the Masoretic scribes left, where they tell the reader, the text originally said this, but you need to read it as this. So what's the difference? Well, lo tamut says, you will not die, Yahweh, Adonai, our Lord. Lo namut says, let us not die, Yahweh. Now, why would they change this? Well, the idea that even saying, Yahweh, you will not die, is irreverent, or at least was in the minds of the scribes. To even speak of the Lord and dying in the same breath just seemed unacceptable. And so it was changed to, let us not die. Now, it's not entirely random or arbitrary. The Septuagint, which is far older than the Masoretic text, but still a translation of the original Hebrew, it has keume apathanomen, we will not die, or let us not die. So it's not just a clear-cut case of, the scribes changed it for no reason. They could have changed it because originally the Hebrew text did say, let us not die, or we will not die. And somewhere along the way that got inadvertently changed. And so they are correcting it. They're fixing it in the Masoretic text. That's possible. This is where you would have to really get into the weeds on text criticism, and you would need to check the commentaries to see how different interpreters handle this. But either way, I think what's going on here, this is an exclamation. So if you take it as we will not, or let us not die, then it's the prophet crying out like, Lord, in the midst of this horrible, terrifying vision he just got of Babylon coming through, he's crying out to God like, aren't you the ancient one? Don't let us die. Or if the original was, you will not die, then the sense of this poetic line may be, Lord, you are ancient, you are from old, you are Mekedem, you won't die. The implication is, but we will. So I think either way, you can make sense of this line. It'll just depend on which text you give more weight to. But the second half of the verse is much more clear. He says, La mishpat, for justice. There's that word again, mishpat, and being used ironically for justice. You placed him, or you appointed him, you put him. He's talking about the Babylonian army, about Babylon personified as this mighty warrior coming through. And so the prophet he could either be ironically, he's like, for justice, you put him, like you appointed this guy or these people for justice, or he could be acknowledging, like God could have revealed to him and he could be understanding now, oh, for justice, the same things I've been crying out about, you are using Babylon to judge. Either way, it's a terrifying prospect. Vasur lahokiach, and a rock to chasten, yasadto. You laid it, or you established it, you set it. It's like setting a cornerstone of a building or something, like a rock to chasten, to punish. So verse 12, again, it's either he's crying out like in disbelief, like this is what you've appointed to chasten, this is what you've placed for justice, or he's acknowledging, okay, Lord, I understand that you're doing this. Either way, verse 13, he's not cool with it. We see the chutzpah in Habakkuk. Look what he says. Tahor enayim meroth ra. Literally, pure of eyes from looking at evil or disaster. Ra'ah, evil, wicked, bad, misfortune, calamity, disaster. Ra is a very general word. If you followed our Psalm study, you've seen this word a lot. So he's saying, Lord, your eyes are too pure to look at evil. Like this is Orthodox theology, right? God, everybody knows from Torah, the whole tabernacle, sacrificial gradations of holiness woven into the fabric of Torah, of Israel as a society, was all about keeping impure or unholy humanity out of the immediate presence of a holy and a pure God. The two don't mix. And so that's what he's saying. Eyes too pure to look on evil, v'habit el amal, and looking upon amal, there's the word again, toil or trouble, you are not able. Here's Habakkuk saying something that God can't do. You know, people say, oh, God can do anything. Actually, not really. There's some things God can't do because they would contradict or violate his very nature. And that's what Habakkuk is getting at in verse 13. He's like, God, your eyes are too pure to look at evil, and looking upon amal or toil, you're not able. So this is the kind of God you are, or the kind of God Habakkuk thinks God should be. So then he asks, Lama tabit bogdim, why are you looking, or do you look upon treacherous ones? And this actually, if you remember back up in verse 5, when we talked about where it says, look upon the nations in the Hebrew text, but in Pesher Habakkuk, it said, look, you treacherous ones. It's the same word. So that lends a little bit more weight to Pesher Habakkuk's translation, but it's not definitive proof one way or the other. It's just that's the word that's used here, bogdim, ones being treacherous. So he cries out, why do you look upon treacherous ones? You are silent, bubala, rasha, tzadik memenu. When he swallows wicked, more righteous than him. So why do you look upon treacherous ones? You're silent when the wicked swallows one more righteous than him. This is the complaint. Habakkuk he's doubling down. He's cried out to the Lord. God's answered him and shown him something disturbing. He doesn't shrink back. He says, wait a minute, Lord. He does what our friend Richard Middleton talked about in his book, Abraham's Silence, where he does what Job does. He's not afraid to reverently talk back to God. And we know it's reverent because he calls him my God, my Holy One. This is not a cynicism looking to disbelieve. This is, I don't understand. You're my God, but I'm going to speak directly to you because you already know the thoughts of my heart anyway. And then responding to this vision of the Babylonian army, Habakkuk picks up on that and says, and you made Adam, humanity, Adam, like fish of the sea, karemesh, lo moshel bo, like creeping ones or creeping things without one, or there is not one ruling over him. Now, this is echoes of the Genesis account. You should be able to pick this up if you are familiar with Genesis 1 in Hebrew, because there are some Genesis terms here. Adam and Remesh. Remesh was one of the categories of the animals that was created on day 6. And so Habakkuk is now lamenting to God, you've made humans, Adam, you've made us like fish of the sea. You know, fish don't have a ruler. They don't have a king. They just swim around in schools. And what happens? They get caught. Kulo b'chaka he'ala. All of them by a fish hook he brings up. He drags them in his net. V'ya'aspehu b'mikmarto. And he gathers them in his, and I've just translated this as trawl, or some say dragnet, or these are just two different kinds of nets. So the image at the beginning of verse 15 is basically comparing all of these peoples that Babylon is just absolutely destroying, taking over, subjugating, oppressing, conquering. They're compared to fish that are caught by hooks and nets by fishermen. Babylon is the fisherman in this case. Al-Kain, therefore, or because of this, Yismak v'yagil. He rejoices and he cheers. That's what fishermen do when they catch fish. They're happy. Well, that's what Babylon does, Habakkuk is saying, with people that are being dragged in the nets. Al-Kain, therefore, or because of this, he sacrifices to his net. Vikater lamikmarto. And he burns incense to his trawl, or his dragnet. So the fisherman, now the image is of this fisherman being so excited with this huge catch of fish that he then worships what got him that catch of fish, which is his net. In the metaphor that Habakkuk is using then, the net that Babylon worships is Babylon's military might, its strength. That's what they burn incense or offer sacrifices to. For by them, Shamain Helko, rich is his portion, uma'akalo bira, and his food is fat. Now, this is ancient, so fat meant good, like it's a parallel for rich. The fat portion was considered the best portion. So the fisherman in this image is sacrificing to his nets, his tools, because his tools, his nets, are what have made his portion rich and his food fat. So the idea in Habakkuk's mind is Babylon is just getting richer and fatter off of the destruction, the empire, the domination, the subjugation, the conquering of all of these peoples. And therefore, then they're praising their military might. They're praising their God. And that's true of empires everywhere. Every empire in human history has gotten fat or rich off of those who it has conquered or subjugated, whether militarily or economically or both. And therefore, it has praised its own strength and it has worshiped its own might. That's what empires do. From the ancient times up until today in 2025, when this is being recorded, that's what empires do. They worship their might. They burn incense to their net. And so Habakkuk says in verse 17, Ha'al-Kain, and this is the ha at the beginning of this lets you know this is a question. Because of this, Yarik Hermo, will he empty his net? V'tamid lachrog, and continually slaughter goyim, nations, no yachmol, without pity. So that's what Habakkuk is asking. Is this just going to keep happening, God? Is he going to empty out the nets so that he can go on slaughtering nations without pity? This is how you know it's goyim. The nations are what is being pictured in this image, this metaphorical depiction of a fisherman. Now, interestingly, Pesher Habakkuk has an alternate reading. Instead of Yarik Hermo, it has Yarik Hervo, and then Tamid, which is this word down here, but it's put in this phrase. So Pesher Habakkuk would read, because of this, Ha'al-Kain, will he Yarik, empty or unsheath his sword. Hervo, Cherev is sword, Cherem is net. Tamid, perpetually. So Pesher Habakkuk, will he therefore continue to unsheath his sword? Or the Hebrew text as it stands, will he therefore continue to empty his net? Either way, it works because the net is an image for the sword, the military might of Babylon. So both readings make the same sense of the text. And the Septuagint kind of carries both of these senses. Ke diapantos apakteinen ethne ufesete. On account of this, will he cast his net and will always not refrain from killing nations. So Septuagint has net, Masoretic text has net, Pesher Habakkuk has sword. So this is Habakkuk's response after the Lord shows him what's going to happen in raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians. This is, again, my attempted a transparent translation that lets you see the differences. But to summarize, verse 12, aren't you from old, Yahweh, my God, my Holy One? You will not die, or possibly let us not die. Yahweh, for justice you placed him, and a rock to chasten you lay it. Eyes too pure to look at evil, and gazing upon toil you can't. Why then do you gaze upon treacherous ones? You're silent when the wicked swallows up one more righteous than him. And you made Adam, humanity, like fish of the sea, like creeping things with no one ruling over him. All of them by a fish hook he brings up. He drags them in his net. He gathers them in his trawl. Therefore he rejoices and cheers. Therefore he sacrifices to his net and he burns incense to his trawl. For by them rich is his portion and his food is fat. Therefore will he empty out his net or unsheath his sword and keep on slaughtering nations without pity? This is what Babylon seemed to be doing in the vision that God gave Habakkuk and in actual history. It seemed as if they were unstoppable and would go on continuing to slaughter, to gather in their nets, so to speak, all of these peoples. They looked unstoppable. And they thought they were unstoppable, and they bragged about their own might. This is Nebuchadnezzar's house inscription. You can find this in Gray's volume, Assyrian and Babylonian Literature, pages 141 and 142. Listen to how Nebuchadnezzar describes himself, the king of Babylon, during this time. He says, I built very high in its tower a large chamber with bitumen and burned brick for my royal dwelling place. Bitumen is like mortar. And brick is used because in the Fertile Crescent, there wasn't a lot of rocks like there are in places like Israel. So everything was built out of brick. So like Egypt and Babylon, they were river nations. And so they didn't have a lot of stone, but they had a lot of mud and they could make a lot of bricks. Actually, they could make slaves make a lot of bricks. So Nebuchadnezzar, I built very high its tower, a large chamber with bitumen and burned brick for my royal dwelling place and joined it to my father's palace. I firmly laid its foundation in the bowels of the earth, and I raised high its turrets like a mountain. I surrounded its turrets with a cornice of ugnu stone and threw around it mountain high a strong wall of bitumen and burnt bricks. On the sides of the wall of Babylon, I built a large wall out of large blocks of stone, such as are found on the lofty mountains. And like a mountain, I raised on high its battlements. I built that house for the astonished gaze of all people, and for the spectacle of the whole world, I filled it with splendor. Just note, Nebuchadnezzar didn't do any of this. A bunch of people forcibly did this for him. But this is how he's praising and describing his works and why he did it. He's bragging about building a mountain in the low-lying floodplain of Babylon. I built this mighty mountain. Now, you can see Isaiah 14, 4 through 21 to see what God thinks about it, because God's going to give a taunt to the king of Babylon and about him thinking he's so high and lofty and about how he's going to be brought down because he's just a mortal. So read Isaiah 14. If you want to pause this and read that real quick, you can, but it's kind of tangential to what we're looking at in this study. But it's very interesting to compare the two accounts, Nebuchadnezzar's account of himself and God's account of Nebuchadnezzar. So this is how Habakkuk chapter 1 ends. And then in chapter 2, it's like Habakkuk knows he has been bold. He knows that it's almost like he's expecting a rebuke, because look how he starts chapter 2. We're going to end actually on chapter 2, verse 1 for this episode. But look at what Habakkuk gets himself ready for. He says, at my post I will stand, or I will take my stand, and I will station myself upon the rampart, and I will watch to see what he will speak against me, or possibly this could be what he will speak through me. So some interpreters say he's now going to stand and wait for God to give him a message for everyone, for the people, because that's what a prophet does. He's like a watchman on the wall. But others, and this is the view I find more convincing, is this should be translated as against me, not through me, but against me. And that Habakkuk is bracing himself, standing as a watchman on the wall, seeing this horrendously terrible vision that God has given him of what's going to literally happen to the watchmen on the walls of actual Jerusalem. And he has pushed back against it to God. He has been very bold. Like we said, he has shown chutzpah in how he's talking back to the Almighty. And so I think you get a sense of he's saying, I will watch to see what he will speak against me. And then the parallel in the next part of the verse is why I think this is more likely. Uma, and how I will respond upon my reprimand or upon my rebuke. So in other words, he's readying himself for God to come and give him a smackdown, for a Job-like encounter, perhaps, where Job questions God and then God shows up. I think that's what Habakkuk is doing. I think he's like, Lord, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to let it out, and then I'm going to stand there and wait for how you're going to rebuke me, because I know you are, but I'm still going to say it anyway. So this brings up the idea of when can and when can you not talk back to God? When does lament become rebellion? When does grief and sorrow expressed become cynicism and opposition? Part of it, like we said, Habakkuk is doing this within the context of a relationship, just like Job. When Job spoke back to God, it wasn't as some foreign deity. It was as his God, his Redeemer. Same thing with Habakkuk. He speaks, but he's speaking to my God, my Holy One. So the relationship is still there. That is the key feature. David Pryor says, there's always been this important distinction between bitter cynicism and believing confrontation. One is a denial that refuses to believe. The other is a belief that refuses to deny. That's so good. Someone looking for a reason to not believe versus someone who believes so strongly and so intimately that they are looking for some way to make sense of it that doesn't deny the reality and the pain that they're experiencing. It says one makes assertions and will not stay for an answer. The other makes assertions and will not move until there is an answer. At my post, I'll stand and I'll station myself upon the rampart and I'll watch to see what he will speak against me and how I will respond when I'm rebuked. That is not denial of God. That is not blasphemy. That is not unbelief. That is genuine pain crying out to the only one who is actually able to listen and respond and act to do something. This is prayer. This is the wrestling with God. I mean, it's what the name Israel comes from, wrestles with God. The name of the entire people going all the way back to their ancestor, Jacob, who got his name changed from Yaakov, heel grabber or supplanter, to Yisrael, struggles with God. Because it was in that literal grappling match with God, a literal divine jujitsu session, that Yaakov became Yisrael. And Habakkuk is carrying on in that tradition. He is not afraid to wrestle with God, to bare his heart. The psalmists aren't afraid to. The prophets aren't afraid to. People who are in genuine relationship with God know that God is big enough to handle our pain and our frustration and our fear and our uncertainty and our calling God to account for behavior that from our perspective doesn't seem to be right, not because we stand over God in judgment, but because we can't see any other way. And God knows that. He knows we're finite creatures. He created us this way. He enters into relationship with humanity, and he welcomes this type of raw, genuine, faithful wrestling. And what we're going to see in the next session is God gives Habakkuk an answer, and the answer he gives him is a vision. And he's going to tell Habakkuk, write down this vision, make it clear upon the tablets. And then there's some question about how the next part of that phrase should be translated so that the one calling upon it can run, or so that the reader might pursue them. We'll talk about that in the next episode. But God does answer his prayer, and he answers it with a vision. And what the vision is going to do is it's going to orient Habakkuk to a basic truth that it's not a matter of we are the good and they are the wicked. We, Judah, are the righteous, and they, Babylon, are the wicked. It's not going to be that. The vision is actually going to reorient Habakkuk's entire way of thinking to see that, no, the line between good and evil cuts through every single person. And there's going to be two ways presented, the way of the righteous and the way of the calloused or the swollen or puffed up, and how they respond to the same events and the same uncertainties. So we'll look into that in more detail. I'll just give you a preview of coming attractions. Myrtle Theochorus in her commentary says, the vision of the end will come and it's worth waiting for. However, the delay has the function of differentiating between the proud and the righteous. That'd be in chapter 2, verse 4. Delay will reveal those who are seriously and uncompromisingly committed to the coming reality and those whose spirit is not right in them. In other words, the wicked in Israel who defraud their neighbors, which Habakkuk noted in chapter 1, verse 4, are just as bad as the bloodthirsty Chaldeans in 1:6 and 2:5. So it's not going to just be as simple as righteous Israel and wicked Gentiles, oppressed Judah and evil Babylon. Not going to be that simple. So here are the discussion questions if you're doing this as a small group or in a group setting. Number one, I want you to discuss with each other, how does Habakkuk challenge our tendency to divide the world into good guys and bad guys? And then number two, in light of that, what are some ways God's people can maintain unity in the midst of cultural or political disagreements? In a context, in a society where the temptation to offer incense to our nets, to offer sacrifices to our drag nets, in countries where their might is their justice. And God's people are called to give allegiance to various powers, various rulers, or where Christians may look and see things like toil and strife and destruction and violence and lawsuit, contention, like where all of that is happening, where Christians can have good faith disagreements on what is the best way to deal with those things. What is the best way to handle violence? What is the best way to handle oppression? Like at a societal level, there are going to be times where Christians just do not agree. The goal is the same. Our desire is to encourage shalom, to encourage righteousness, peace, wholeness, to oppose injustice. But in the day-to-day reality and at a societal level, there may be very different visions of how that should happen. So someone who's, say, a Catholic in Long Island may have a very different way of dealing with it than an Amish in Pennsylvania or a Baptist in East Texas. So how are some practical ways? Talk about this with your group. What are ways, if you want to identify some of those areas where Christians have good faith disagreements or where you feel like Christians are being pulled to side with some of the empire powers of this world and even sometimes trying to use scripture to justify it, what are some of those ways and how, as the people of God, should we approach not just one another, but the culture around us as well? So we'll pick it back up in our next episode where we get into the thick of chapter 2. We'll come to the most famous verse in all of Habakkuk, chapter 2, verse 4. And then after that, possibly in another episode, we're going to look at the woes, the 5 woes of Habakkuk chapter 2 to see God's perspective on a lot of these things. That'll do it for now. If you find this study helpful, again, we would love for you to subscribe if you haven't done so already and tap that little notifications bell. Just a great way to quickly and easily support this teaching ministry. Thanks to those of you who continually support us, and stay tuned for more as we continue our walk through the book of Habakkuk. That's all for now. We'll see you next time. In the meantime, as always, keep training.